Hello, Ignatian family. My name is Jorge Palacios Jr., and I am the Migration Coordinator for Youth Engagement and Director of the Indocu Network for the Ignatian Solidarity Network. I have the pleasure and honor of breaking open the realities of our country's current state of play regarding immigration policy. I hope that this video, along with the backgrounder and talking points that have been made for this year's teach-in, will serve as a sufficient introduction to the political and policy realities of an immigration system that is complicated by design. This intentionally complicated nature is important to acknowledge because those who are most directly impacted by these policies may not speak English at all or might not be fluent. They may not have a formal education. They may not have the funds to afford legal help. They may be fleeing violence and persecution. They may have experienced serious trauma while in transit. These sorts of people will often be seriously disadvantaged in understanding the very policies on which their lives and livelihoods are staked. So today we're going to talk about 5 things. We're going to talk about asylum and the recent attempts to restrict access to it. We're going to talk about TPS, otherwise known as Temporary Protected Status. We're going to talk about DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, why we need to expand legal pathways to entry, and lastly, we're going to talk about pathways to citizenship. So, an asylum seeker is a person who is fleeing violence and or persecution in their home country and is therefore seeking protection from another government. According to U.S. law, the reasons a person may be granted asylum are based on fear of violence or persecution based on race or ethnicity, their nationality, their religion, their political opinion, or a membership to a particular social group. Asylum is not granted based on fear of generalized violence due to gang, cartel, or other criminal activity where they live, fear of violence due to gender or sexuality, general climate displacement, or for lack of opportunities in the home country. Traditionally, asylum seekers present themselves at a port of entry to the U.S. and let the Border Patrol agent know they are seeking asylum, and that begins a formal process, which includes meeting before a judge and having that judge hear their asylum claim. So in March of 2020, the Trump administration announced a public health emergency due to the COVID pandemic. This allowed them to activate Title 42, which allowed them to immediately expel migrants who were attempting to enter the U.S., so that prevented them from being able to even hear those asylum claims. The public health emergency ended on May 11th of 2023. And in its place was a phone app that the U.S. uses to assign appointments for interviews for asylum. These appointments are given on a lottery system. People log in, and it is random whether they get those appointments or not based on availability. CBP claims that they are giving more weight to people who've been waiting for longer, but still there are many examples of people who've been waiting many months, in some cases well over a year for an appointment. The application in its initial rollout was full of bugs. It had very limited translation, and the appointment systems are still significantly harder for families to access because there are a number of slots that are released on a daily basis, and so a family of 4 or a family of 6 might have a harder time getting the correct number of slots than, say, a person traveling by themselves or a person traveling with one child. And of course, the most recent activity that limited asylum is this final rule that was issued by the Biden administration, finally with the name Securing the Border. This is implemented at the agency level, and so it does a few things. It bars access to asylum until daily entry numbers, or rather daily encounter numbers, fall below 1,500 for 28 consecutive days. This was originally proposed at 7 days, but it had been extended after the rule was finalized. It also presumes that migrants are ineligible for asylum if they do not arrive at a legal port of entry, or if they passed through other countries first without seeking asylum. Now, let's pivot a little bit. Let's talk about temporary protected status. TPS is a status given to people who are already present in the United States, who are nationals of a country experiencing ongoing armed conflict, an environmental disaster, or any temporary or extraordinary conditions that would prevent that foreign national from returning safely. This allows beneficiaries to live, and in some cases to work in the United States for a limited amount of time. And lastly, let's talk about DACA. So DACA, also known as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was another rule implemented. This was implemented during the Obama administration. And it was implemented after a piece of legislation known as the DREAM Act was not able to pass in Congress. The DREAM Act would have been a pathway to citizenship for many, many young people who arrived to the U.S. as children. So DACA was sort of a band-aid solution, right? It is not a legal status, it is not a form of documentation, and it is not a pathway to citizenship. What it is a deprioritization for deportation. So folks register themselves, and in registering themselves, they are put at the very bottom of the list for deportation. In theory, they will never be deported. Alongside this, there was an addition of a work authorization, and so folks who registered are given this authorization to work legally in the United States. The cutoff date for applying for DACA, for being eligible for DACA, is way too in the past for most current college students to be eligible. Additionally, DACA, because it is a rule of the administration, it is not law. It has been challenged in the courts many times, including right now. So it is being held up in the courts right now. Currently, what this means is that there are no new applicants who can apply. So even folks who are eligible but haven't applied in the past cannot apply. And so DACA could go away at any moment. Now, we've talked about these ways that people can enter the U.S., but it seems like we are putting more and more limits as a country on who can and can't enter and under what circumstances. For us, Catholic social teaching holds that individuals have the right to migrate for a better life, while also maintaining that nations have the right to enforce their borders. We know from our experience that migrants and the communities that welcome migrants mutually benefit from the migration of these new people. And Pope Francis has repeatedly called on Catholics and people of faith to welcome, to protect, to promote, and to integrate their new neighbors. So what we are asking for is a restoration of access to asylum and for more opportunities for people to migrate with dignity. One piece of legislation that we are talking about this year is the Climate Displaced Persons Act. My colleague Josh Otter has gone into a little bit more depth about this in the policy briefing for climate displacement. Please watch that. The other opportunity that we have is to create pathways to citizenship, right? To legalize status. There are currently 11 million undocumented people living in the country right now. And so the other piece of legislation that we will talk about is the Registry Act. Formally, it is known as Renewing Immigration Provisions of the Immigration Act of 1929. It would provide long-term residents meaningful access to the legal immigration system by updating Section 249 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, known as the Registry, which is why we call it the Registry Act. This registry statute was first enacted in 1929, and it has been modified 4 times in its history. Most recently under the Reagan administration, to modernize restrictions and advance the cutoff date for eligibility. However, this has remained unchanged since 1986, and to qualify, today, an immigrant must have lived in the U.S. since January 1st of 1972. That's more than 50 years ago. For that reason, registry is no longer fulfilling its intended purpose, as the cutoff date is far too in the past to be relevant for most people. The way that registry works, when it does work, is that it creates a discretionary process by which immigrants who have resided in the U.S. for many years can apply and obtain a green card. This is also known as legal residency. And all this happens after undergoing extensive vetting. The renewing immigration provisions of the Immigration Act of 1929, the Registry Act, is essential legislation to preserve registry. By simply updating the existing program, the bill would provide a much-needed pathway to legal residency and eventually citizenship for millions of dreamers and their parents, forcibly displaced people, highly skilled members of our workforce, and other deserving immigrants who have lived in the U.S. for at least 7 years, but have no other straightforward means to regularize their status. Thank you for your commitment to advocating for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. I hope that this policy briefing, combined with the advocacy resources ISN has put together, and the lived experiences of the many people speaking at IFTJ about the issue area of migration, as well as your own lived experiences, whether through immersion trips, your own history, or your own family history around migration, and your encounters with migrants in your everyday lives will inform the richness with which you will enter advocacy meetings on Monday, October 28th with your elected officials to advocate for humane policies for migration. Thank you, and God bless.